Hi, my name's Mikey Hensman, and I'd love to share my story about growing up in Zimbabwe with a whole range of different pets and how that has transitioned into a life of anti-poaching and law enforcement using dogs, and also about a new company that I recently set up with a very good friend of mine called Resolve Wildlife, where we look to be protecting the Lower Zambezi in the future.
Welcome to The Trail Less Traveled, an adventure radio series and podcast dedicated to collecting stories and sounds from around the world in order to take you back to mankind's earliest form of entertainment, storytelling. Missoula, Montana is a mecca for outdoor enthusiasts, and each week we will bring you tales of adventure from both near and far, as well as information and inspiration and a few tunes to set the mood. You can subscribe to the podcast and learn about our international outreach projects at traillesstraveled.net. And now, here's your host, international expedition guide, conservationist, and yogi, Mandela.
This evening, The Trail Less Traveled is being recorded on the Lower Zambezi River. It's night. You can probably hear some of the sounds of night in the background. And I have been working on this project where I ask people to interview their friends or their mentor or their parent to step back as a producer and facilitate these conversations. And so this evening I have asked Ricardo, who is the owner of Kanyemba Lodge here on the Lower Zambezi, to interview his friend, Mike. And so I'm going to go ahead and hand over the microphone to Ricardo.
This is Ricardo Garbacho. I'm the owner of Kanyemba Lodge and Vice Chairman of Conservation Lower Zambezi. We're on the banks of the Lower Zambezi. Playing host to Mandela, who's staying with us, and we're doing a few chats and interviews with other stakeholders in the Lower Zambezi. We're here with Mike Hensman, who has been working with us for quite a few years at Conservation Lower Zambezi. And he first came out to implement the Canine unit that helps in anti-poaching and law enforcement in our conservation efforts. And we are sitting on two rocking chairs trying to figure out how and why Michael Hensman does what he does. Fire away, Michael.
I was born on a farm in Zimbabwe and a very privileged upbringing. So my father was a commercial agriculture, but he had dedicated a large portion of our farm to conservation. And my cousin was also a vet. So we had all sorts of orphaned animals coming through our home that we raised from young and landed up releasing onto the section of the farm that had been dedicated to wildlife. So we had all sorts of pets growing up, from, the regular horses and cattle and all that stuff, dogs, obviously. But then on the other side, we had orphaned elephants that we raised, and we've had impala, kudus, warthog, all with pretty humorous names like hoggles. And we had a serval called Tika. Yeah, so really a very privileged upbringing, growing up around all sorts of different animals. And I think that's where my interest in conservation and wildlife and conservation in general, I think that's where the seed was planted and sowed. And we obviously had, my father was a very well-known polo player. So we had high-performance horses, arguably the best in Southern Africa. So grew up training those, schooling them, preparing them for polo. I was a polo player myself, though not by any stretch of the imagination as good as my father was. So we got into that, and I guess that's where the seed was originally sown, and a bit about the upbringing that I had.
Zimbabwe.
What happened to your farm and the rest of your family? Is it a similar story to other peers of yours, or few people know the recent history of farming in Zimbabwe? You want to give us a bit of a rundown on that, and of course the effects on your family? And
Zimbabwe's, I guess they call it the breadbasket because it's right in the middle, or it's in the heart of Africa, and extremely fertile soils, great rainfall, so it's really suited to incredible agriculture. So a lot of wheat, tobacco, soyas, maize are produced there. The political situation in Zim, when we speak about that, it's a movement by ZANU-PF, which was the ruling party at the time, to force farmers out of the country so that they could maintain power through the elections. Yeah, so we were in the same boat as many other Zimbabweans, or I'd say the majority of the farming community. The political situation turned in about 2003. That's when we first felt the pressure as a family to get out. And my father was very involved in security in our community, and obviously that was part of his passion, was the conservation side of stuff. So he did have a lot of scouts and officers that were working on the conservancies in the area. So I think he was targeted amongst the first to get out, and I was exposed to it to some degree, but I was also sheltered from it in many other ways. So I was at school down in South Africa when the worst part of the farm invasions happened, and I only really got exposure to the hard side of it when I was back on holidays and that sort of stuff. But yeah, we were forced off the farms in 2003, and yeah, it was tragic for everyone. We pretty much left Zim with nothing and had to start up again in South Africa, and not having the capital to get back into farming like I think my dad had wanted. We landed up depending on, training animals, particularly elephants, to make a living. And that's, I think, where animal training side of life for me began.
Very cool. And so your family started training elephants that originally were orphaned, am I right?
Yeah, so the first elephants that we got were orphans from the culling operations that were happening in Zimbabwe, and that was way earlier than when the political situation started. And we speak about culling, and I guess many people wouldn't know what it means. So in Zimbabwe there was this idea that there was an overpopulation of elephant, meaning that there were too many for the habitat to sustain, and by being so many they put pressure on the habitat, which negatively impacted other animals. So they had to control the numbers through various mechanisms, one of which was shooting them. When we got the elephants, the intention was to release them onto that portion of the property that I had mentioned had been dedicated to wildlife. But when the elephants arrived, they were way too small to release, and they were very dependent on people still. So we bottle raised them. My stepmother did an incredible job, with that. And then during that phase of transitioning them to the wild, we realized how intelligent they were and how willing they were to cooperate with people and stuff. And so they actually got turfed out pretty much with the horses, and we began using them on the farm like the horses. So they would be used to round up cattle, dip the cattle, and they definitely enjoyed it, and they were really good at it. So they really understood what the whole game was all about, to push the cattle through a dip or whatever. And that's kind of how the elephant story started. We landed up getting more and more over time, and not by choice, but they were just pretty much orphans that kept getting dumped on us because we had the expertise to raise them. And we landed up with quite a large herd that later, once they had grown up, moved down to Big Falls and began the elephant operations down there. Yeah.
How did you eventually come to Zambia for the first time?
So my first exposure to Zambia was to train dogs. So I had met, my first business partner was Jay Crafter from Invictus Canine, and we co-founded Invictus together, and then started training dogs in Gonarazor National Park in the southeast of Zimbabwe. And then once the business was formed and running, our next job was in the Lower Zambezi, and my first exposure to the Lower Zambezi was to implement a canine program here at CLZ. So we brought in 2 Belgian Malinois from Holland, and they were named Liga and Bar, and they had, tracking and detection capabilities and made a huge impact down here in the Lower Zambezi from an anti-poaching perspective.
Mike, how do the dogs themselves work in anti-poaching, and how do they relate with other scouts, and how are they best utilized?
In short, two capabilities. One is detection, and so the dogs that are here are able to detect a wide range of target odors, and so they can smell ivory, rhino horn, pangolin scale, bushmeat, all varieties, so a range of different species. And they also look for fur, skins, and firearms and ammunition. So quite a wide spectrum of odors that they look for, and they're able to search buildings, vehicles, baggage, and open areas. So that's useful, like if an elephant has been poached and the poachers might have discarded cartridges in the bush, the dogs can search around the carcass and recover those cartridges, which is evidence that could potentially lead to arresting the culprit. So that's the detection capability. And then the other capability is tracking, and that is when we come across the tracks of poacher that might have made an incursion into the national park, and we take the dogs there and put them on the track, and then they basically follow those tracks, hopefully to the culprits. And that's their two main roles. They also have a psychological impact just by their presence, and the nature of the dogs that we have are they're Malinois, so they're pretty aggressive looking by nature. So word does spread through the community that the dogs are working in the park and that they potentially bite and whatever. So that tends to keep people out a little bit.
Tell me, what are the biggest challenges in looking after dogs in a wildlife area?
So the Lower Zambezi landscape is pretty unique in terms of the challenges that they present to dogs, because it's extremely hot down here, and heat is one of the big killers of dogs. So it gets 42 degrees. I'm not sure what that is in Fahrenheit, so apologies Americans, but the temperatures really do get very hot, and so we limited in the times that we work the dogs. So we try to work them at night or early in the morning and late in the evening. But another challenge that we have in this landscape is tsetse fly. So it's not something that many people would be familiar with, but tsetse fly are transmitters of a disease called trips, which is the equivalent of human sleeping sickness, and it's fatal to domestic livestock. So on the one hand, it's a blessing because it does keep cattle and goats and those sort of things out of the parks, but it also obviously kills dogs, or potentially kills dogs, if it's not treated quick enough. So tsetse is a major threat here. And another threat is just there's an abundance of wildlife here, which is obviously super appealing, but it also presents challenges. So there's dangerous game around the back of every bush that we go past, and lion, leopard, ellies, buffalo, and all sorts of things like that present risk to the dogs as well. And then obviously the poachers themselves could potentially cause problems. So if the dogs are super successful, there's a risk that the poachers might try to poison the dogs or sabotage them so that they lose their effectiveness.
Tell me, is it more difficult to train the dogs, or is it a bigger challenge to pass on the skills of handling the dogs to the people that have to live with the dogs day to day and use them in conservation efforts?
So we're very lucky because the majority of the dogs that we've imported come from Holland, and they came from really trusted vendors where you get the best genetics and all of that. So the dogs are relatively easy to train. I wouldn't say that it's too easy, but the real challenge is training the handlers. So it takes a lot of time for anybody to learn the behavior of dogs and to understand the different behaviors that they exhibit when they're on track and off, and how to care for the dogs and all of that sort of stuff. But to compound the problem here, the local communities have a very different relationship with animals, and I would say a little bit more distant and less caring, so they don't have the same empathy. And they often see dogs as just a tool. They don't really develop relationships with the dogs. And so that's the hard bit, is trying to find the right person to match the dog and to try and find somebody who has empathy for the dogs and really understands their behavior and who's willing to work with the dogs. So it does take a long time to train the handlers, and our courses for like a detection and tracking course would typically be around 4 months long. And at that point, they would be able to operate with the dog. The handlers would be able to operate with the dogs. And yeah, we do refresher training packages to just upkeep those skills. We've got a really interesting project running at the moment, which is, I'd say, pioneering. So we've got these little village dogs that we procured from the communities around the national park, and we're training those dogs to be in a law enforcement role. And the reason that we've pursued this project is because we believe that these dogs might have something that the foreign dogs can't offer, and that's a tolerance of the hot, harsh climatic conditions here, because they are native to the area, but they also come from the same communities that the handlers come from. So, linking back to what we were discussing earlier, is that the handlers are really comfortable around these dogs compared to the foreign dogs, which are more aggressive looking and that sort of stuff. But there's also an idea that because they come from this community, they might have had exposure to tsetsis, and that they would potentially have more resilience to trips than the foreign dogs would. So they're also a lot smaller in size than the Malinois, so they could have better endurance. They consume less water and eat less food, which means that the handlers have to carry less when they go out on patrol. So there are a lot of benefits. The question has always been about whether they're trainable or not. And we procured 2 village puppies earlier in the year, and they're showing huge potential. So they're already detecting a bunch of different odors and are able to track pretty significant distances, and in some respects they're surpassing the Malinois in terms of their tracking ability because of the age of the tracks that they can follow. So they're able to follow older tracks and in the hotter conditions. So only time is going to tell whether it is truly a capability or not, but at the moment it's definitely something that looks very promising. Yeah, so the scope of our work has expanded. So I started a company with a good friend of mine, and it's called Resolve Wildlife. So we've got this idea to try and protect areas on a broader scale. So we're looking at landscape scale projects, but also being involved with partners over the long term. The company is called Resolve Wildlife, and our services are training, advice, and assistance. So we offer training to scouts and officers at the tactical level. We also develop SOPs and implement and develop operations rooms at the ops level, and then we're also offering advice at the strategic level, so developing co-management agreements, long-term training plans, offering strategic security advice, trying to protect these landscapes, bringing partners together to work collaboratively towards the ultimate goal of conserving this space.
So, Mandela here. I'm sitting in on this beautiful interview, and I do have a couple questions from Mike. What does a patrol look like for someone listening in the States who doesn't really have an understanding of the poaching that is happening in Africa? You might want to highlight some of the details of that as well.
So there are a bunch of different types of patrol, but the ones that the dogs are typically involved in is they work on the periphery of the park to try and intercept poachers before they reach the park. So those would be like a 10-day patrol where the dogs would go out with a vehicle, and they would do VCPs or vehicle checkpoints and basically stop traffic. They're looking for firearms and ammunition that might be making its way, to poaching syndicates that would use those weapons to hunt or poach the key species that we're trying to protect, so elephants and so on and so forth. And they're also intercepting the wildlife products that are then leaving the park if the poachers are successful and do manage to kill an elephant or something, and they're trying to take the ivory or pangolin scales to market. So that's what the patrols look like on the periphery of the park, but on the interior we're just trying to cover as much ground as possible, and the patrols would operate in areas where there's high instances of poaching, and they'd basically be looking for any signs of poachers, and if they do come across it, they'd attempt to follow up and try to make an apprehension.
I must say it's a beautiful scene here. We're out in the open. It's been a very hot day, as typical October-November days are in Zambia, but there seems to be a slight breeze and the temperature is now becoming very comfortable. Fortunately, we have this big mass of water called the Zambezi, literally less than 30 feet away, that provides a bit more coolness to the environment, much needed. Moving on to chatting with Mike. Mike, you just want to update everybody where we are?
So at the moment we're at Kanyemba Lodge. It's nighttime and obviously stunning. The stars are out and there's not a cloud in the sky, so pretty beautiful scenes. Got the Zambezi River not more than 30 meters from us, and if you can imagine, it's about a kilometer wide where we are, and behind us this massive escarpment, so beautiful hills covered with Miombo woodland and plenty of wildlife around, often views of elephant across the river on the other side, and couldn't get much better, to be honest.
Mike has been with us in the Lower Zambezi on and off for the last 7 years, and he's also been witness to quite a few patrols, been present to quite a few patrols, quite a few accidents, incidents, and certainly quite a few encounters with poachers. Mikey, do you want to tell us some of the incidents or the more peculiar encounters you had out while being out in the valley? You've now been here 7 years on and off, and you've been lucky enough to be present out mentoring a lot of our staff and scouts and out on patrols or on little operations. What is the funniest events you've managed to witness in the 7 years you've been around?
This event didn't actually happen here. It happened in Zimbabwe, but I was out on an afternoon fishing excursion and it was my day off. But during the excursion I came across a bunch of people fish poaching, so using nets to catch fish out of the river, and I wasn't in any mood to chase them, so I called for the Canine unit to come and offer some assistance. And they responded and arrived not too long after. But the poachers by this time had seen me and ventured off trying to get back home. I'm sure they knew that they were going to be followed. I don't think they really anticipated that we would be there so quickly. But anyway, the dog unit arrived and I showed them where the tracks were. They put the dog on the spoor and they started pursuing it. They hadn't gone very far and obviously knew that the poachers weren't armed, so felt it was appropriate to let the dog go off leash. And so they unclipped the dog, and they had a Garmin Alpha 100, which is a tracking device on the dog, so they could see exactly where the dog was, how far it was ahead of them, and what speed it's going and all that sort of stuff. The dog tore off after the poachers on their track, and it's absolutely harmless dog. He has no bite capability whatsoever, but it is a German Shepherd, so he does look pretty intimidating. Anyway, the dog caught up to the poachers, and the handlers had fallen probably a few hundred meters behind, and they were catching up slowly, and the dog caught up to the poachers and the handlers shortly afterwards. But when the handlers arrived on scene, they saw these poachers all on their knees with their hands on their heads and this dog lying in front of them. Obviously the dog was just anticipating the Kong, but quite a funny scene. These guys thought this dog was going to tear them up, but obviously had no intention of doing that. So the handlers arrived to the dog having made a apprehension of about 6 poachers all on his own.
Cool dog. And another event that you've been present at that was certainly gave you the biggest satisfaction or reward?
Yeah, so I think my favorite achievement was actually not far from here, and we had been out running in the morning, and had accidentally bumped into some poachers, and they saw us with the dogs and that sort of stuff, and they tore off into the bush. And we had the dogs there, everything was prepped and ready to go, so we put the dogs on track and followed them. We managed to catch up to them and have another contact with them. It was getting just to nighttime, so the guys managed to escape and we couldn't find their tracks that evening. So we slept on the tracks for the night and woke up early the next morning and set a cordon and tried to find where the tracks were from the previous day. And we managed to come across the tracks, but also discovered that the poachers had also spent the night not far from where we had been sleeping ourselves. So it was a nice fresh track, and we put the dog on the spoor again, and he covered a huge distance in very little time. So I think we did about 10 kilometers in just over an hour, which is like pretty fast going. And when we reached the village where the poachers had gone into, we couldn't get in there because the village is pretty hostile towards the law enforcement, and there were only 4 of us in the team at the time. So we had to wait for reinforcements to get in. And while we were waiting for the reinforcements to arrive, the poachers were having lunch in the village. We didn't know that at the time. But once reinforcements came, we managed to get in and chatted to the lady that had fed them, and they mentioned that the poachers had just left out the back of the house and were heading up the escarpment. So we put the dog on the spoor again, and we tracked up the escarpment. And I think I told you about how harsh the conditions are here. It's phenomenally hot, and the escarpment is really rough terrain. It's pretty much mountains, 800 meters elevation from the valley floor to the peak, and we tracked up there for another 25k. So in total it was a 35 kilometer track, and managed to actually catch up to the poachers and make an arrest. So in terms of achievement, that is by far the longest track that I've ever done with the team. And I mean, those guys really had to work hard to make that all happen. So absolute kudos to them. They never gave up, and the dog had a phenomenal performance, and it did ultimately land up in a huge success. So yeah, of all of our achievements, that one was pretty standout for me.
Cool. Mikey, we also are involved with more advanced technology like tracking animals through satellite-colored systems on different animals. Do you want to maybe explain to our listeners how that helps in data gathering and in conservation efforts?
Yeah, so a lot of key species are collared just for general protection, so that we can monitor their movements and keep track of where they go and stuff. And it is really useful for us because elephants, for example, move along pathways, and they also are water dependent. So by following their movements and tracking their movements, we can see where there might be water in the escarpment that we hadn't known about historically. So we can, anticipate where poachers might concentrate. But because the elephants are literally walking the routes where elephants concentrate, it also highlights to us the areas that we need to focus our own patrols in order to protect them. So the collars offer a lot of insight into that sort of stuff, but they also help us prevent human-wildlife conflict. So by collaring the elephants, we can track their movements around communities, and if they do go into communities, then we can make interventions to try and help the community protect their crops in those areas against the wildlife, or move the elephant or whatever. So there's lots of advantages to the collaring of wildlife like that. But yeah, there are other systems that really do give us insight into where poaching activities are predominant, and it helps us guide our patrols to monitor those areas more carefully.
Mikey, what's your dream 10, 20 years from now in terms of where we are? Human-wildlife conflict, poaching, communities. What's your dream?
I think the dream is to see our children's children be able to experience these landscapes the same way that we experience it now. I don't think it's ever going to be identical, but if they can get the same pleasure from the wildlife and the landscape and the relationship that we have with wildlife that we're exposed to, then I think the world would be a better place. And if we can achieve that, then the dream is happening.
If someone is listening who's very inspired by your work and wants to support you and your organization, how can they find out more information?
So we on Instagram, you can find us there, resolve.wildlife, Facebook the same. But I think the best way you could support us is to support our partners. So, Conservation Lower Zambezi and the Lower Zambezi landscape is doing an incredible job, and, they obviously support us. So they're the guys on the ground where the tire meets the tar, and the guys making the real impact. So I think getting in touch with organizations like CLZ that are doing incredible work, and that's the best way that you could support this place.
Ricardo, what's your website?
Website of Conservation Lower Zambezi is conservationlowerzambezi.org. Kanyemba.com. Have you guys got a website yet?
Yeah, actually we do have a website, and it was launched 2 days ago. So you're welcome to go onto our website, which is www.resolvewildlife.org. I'm very proud of it. So jump on and have a look at what we do.
Yeah, Mike, I am going to sign us off. I think we've had all a long day, and it's a warm one, even though it's a beautiful evening right now. Cool. And from Ricardo, it's a good night. One good night also from
Mikey. So, good night, everyone. Thanks for listening.
What's the advice you'd like to give to our listeners? If there's one thing you could say for them or tell them to do, or some advice for anybody, really, what would it be?
Yes, on the spot here, but every little thing that you do counts, so don't overlook the small things. And every small thing that you can do is going to make a difference. So keep doing the small things, and collectively we'll make a massive impact.
Bessa, we are here at Conservation Lower Zambezi, and we are here with the dogs that are trained to help prevent poaching in this part of Zambia. Bessa, I want to know all about Conservation Lower Zambezi.
The reason why they actually established the Conservation Lower Zambezi, because of poaching was destroying wildlife in the Lower Zambezi, and that's how they came up with this Conservation Lower Zambezi, to support the Department of National Parks and Wildlife so that they can protect the wildlife in the Lower Zambezi. The Conservation Lower Zambezi, it's actually got 3 pillars. We have one, which is the wildlife protection. This is where we will work hand in hand with the Department of National Parks and Wildlife in terms of protecting the Lower Zambezi. And then we do have environmental education as the second pillar. This is where we work with the Minister of Education. We work at the 5 schools around the Lower Zambezi by imparting knowledge into school children to understand the benefits of conservation and how they can look after the wildlife of the Lower Zambezi and the environment. And the third pillar, which is the community support, we also try to support the local people in terms of medication methods, in terms of women empowerment projects, and also to ensure that people and wildlife, they can thrive. And in a nutshell, our objective in community support, we want to promote coexistence where human and wildlife, they can actually live in harmony than killing each other. I think that's one of the most important thing with our 3 pillars.
If you want to find out more information, you can visit conservationlowerzambezi.org. And there are many ways that you can support. And I'm just curious, the money that people donate, what is that going to be used for? The reason I ask, when people ask me about what they can do to help, I say make sure you research organizations before you donate, just to make sure the majority of the money is going to work on the ground. And I've toured your facility here. I've met people. I know for a fact that money people donate is actually going back to communities and helping wildlife, and it's being used well.
Basically, I would like to encourage everyone who would like to support Conservation Lower Zambezi to go on our website and choose the area you would like to support. what you're interested in supporting conservation Lower Zambezi, we do a lot of work here. We have wildlife protection. This is also, when I talk about wildlife protection, under this pillar, we do have a lot of units. We have the marine units. These marine units, their work is entirely on the Zambezi River to make sure that the wildlife on the Zambezi River is protected, because we are actually living with our core neighbors, which is Zimbabwe. So the marine unit actually, they work in terms of protecting cross borders wildlife illegal trade. So if you are interested in supporting a marine unit, you are welcome. And also we do have the Canine unit. This is where we have about 4 dogs, and these dogs are involved into protecting wildlife in terms of, these are sniffing dogs. They actually sniff ivory, linehorn, pangolin, scale and meat, and also firearm, and smell bushmeat. And also they can track poacher. So if you're interested in supporting the Canine unity, please, you are welcome. And also we do have also the Lapid deployment team. This is also a unit which works around Lower Zambezi. They are always on mobile actually. They work according to information they actually gather from the intelligent information network, where they normally actually get this information, and then they work retrieving a lot of firearms from the poachers. And also if you do have interest in terms of supporting this unit, please, you are welcome to visit our website. And we are also affiliated with Virgin Money. Visit our website, you'll see there is Virgin Money. We're under environmental education program also. Whatever you want also to support in terms of school visit, so many activities under environmental education. Of the school visits, this is where we bring in school children from Ruangwa, Funsa, Chongwe, Chinyunyu, and Chiawa. If you want to support one school visit, maybe Chiawa, or maybe Chonyunyu, maybe Ruangwa, you are welcome. This is where we are actually trying to promote coexistence. So we can also support us in terms of empowering women in solar-powered education system. It can also help us in terms of supporting the local farmers in terms of awareness and also mitigation methods, how they can protect their crops. You can support us for these smelly elephant repellent training workshops, and also we do have also ant-snare campaign and living with elephant training workshops. So we can also support, if you want us to increase more awareness, the danger of setting up a snare in the wildlife, which actually also increases human wildlife conflict when an animal is caught in a wire snare. We are asking you if you can also choose among all these things I've explained, donate, or you can support in terms of increasing awareness in the community, or supporting a solar powered irrigation system to the women, or if you want, you can support us in education program, or if you want also to support us more in HIV education. We have also actually, I did forget something, Mandela also, we have actually introduced the Woka. Woka, it's a Nyanja name, which means awakening in English. We have also introduced another activities encouraging the children to understand the benefit of education. These are kind of activities that are undertaken by Conservation Lower Zambezi. Yeah, and for further more information, please reach out to our website, which is www.conservationlowerzambezi.org. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Caroline Kurtz, and I'm a board member of the Montana Natural History Center. Our mission is to further the appreciation, understanding, and stewardship of nature through education. The other day, I was startled by the sudden appearance of 6 red-breasted robins at eye level, bouncing around the top of our backyard ash tree as seen out of an upstairs window. Not all robins disappear from western Montana every winter, but I certainly hadn't seen any for a long time. Their boisterous activity and bright chest feathers surprised and delighted me. Who have you heard or seen around your house these days? Learn more about birds and their habits by becoming a member of the Montana Natural History Center. Visit montananaturalist.org for more information. That's montananaturalist.org.
That's it for this week's adventure, my friends in Missoula and around the world. But until next week, please remember, conservation is not a spectator sport. Living in Missoula is a privilege. With privilege comes responsibility. Please get educated and engaged. Speak up on behalf of wildlife and wild places. And if you think you're too small to make a difference, well then you've never spent the night with a mosquito.